Hi there. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whatever time it is. As always, happy whatever day it is you're watching this, and welcome. I'm Larry Erickson. This is the Erickson Report. And before we get to this week's festivities, I have to make a correction from last time. In the last show, in discussing the trial of Kyle Rittenhouse, I said I thought one of the factors that I was sure was involved in how it's being dealt with was the fact that you had a baby-faced white boy on one hand and three young black men in the other. That was incorrect. His victims were white. They were not black. So I needed to correct that. But at the same time, I still have to say that I can't help but wonder if a factor involved here is a baby-faced white boy in one hand and three Black Lives Matter protesters on the other. Now, the jury is actually in deliberations as I'm doing this, so that I don't know how the trial came out. You probably do. But I wanted to make a general comment to say that it seems to me there should be a point beyond which having inserted yourself knowingly and consciously, by which I mean, you're not a cop, you're not an emergency worker, you're not somebody whose job it is to go into chaotic situations, but you've done this of your own free choice. Having inserted yourself of your free choice into a chaotic situation, carrying a loaded gun, is there a point beyond which self-defense is no longer a valid defense when something goes wrong? All right, anyway, with that out of the way, let's get to this, because the show is going to be on during the week surrounding Thanksgiving. So it seems a good time to do, as I do pretty much every year, to say, gather around, kiddies. I'm going to tell you the real story, the actual based on historical account story of the Thanksgiving. By which, of course, I mean the event that occurred in what's now Plymouth, Massachusetts in the fall of 1621, which is the basis for our now traditional Thanksgiving holiday. One of the reasons I do this almost every year is that it's amazing just how much misinformation and mythology there is out there about this. In fact, it seems revisionist history about the events have become almost as traditional as, turkey and pumpkin pie. I like to try to bring some hard historical reality to the discussion. So to start our Thanksgiving tale, consider this. Our harvest being gotten in, our governor sent 4 men on fowling, so that we might, after a special manner, rejoice together after we had gathered the fruits of our labors. They 4 in one day killed as much fowl as, with a little help besides, served the company almost a week. At which time, amongst other recreations, we exercised our arms, many of the Indians coming amongst us, and among the rest their greatest king, Massasoit, with some 90 men, whom for 3 days we entertained and feasted. And they went out and killed 5 deer, which they brought to the plantation and bestowed on our governor and upon the captain and others. And though it be not always so plentiful as it was at this time with us, yet by the goodness of God we are so far from want that we often wish you partakers of our plenty. Okay, that comes from a letter dated December 11, 1621. It was written by Edward Winslow, a Mayflower passenger and one of the early leaders of the colony. By the way, this portrait here is of Edward Winslow, and it was done in 1651, 30 years after the event and after he had returned to England. It is the only known confirmed portrait of a Mayflower passenger known to exist. As for the rest of them, we have no idea what they look like, despite or beyond the traditional description of Miles Standish as being short with red hair. That's a description that's given some backing by the fact that in 1637, there was a rather nasty satire of the settlement called A New English Canaan, put out by a man named Thomas Morton. And in that satire, Standish is described as Captain Shrimp. Now, Winslow's letter was contained in a book published in England in 1622 under the rather ponderous title of A Relation or Journal of the Beginning and Proceedings of the English Plantations Settled at Plymouth in New England by Certain English Adventurers, both merchants and others. The book is popularly known today by the less cumbersome title of Mort's Relation, and it consists of eyewitness accounts of various events during the first year of the settlement. Now, here's why Winslow's letter is important here. It is the only contemporaneous account of what we now know as the first Thanksgiving which is known to exist. The only other even near contemporaneous account comes from William Bradford, longtime governor of the settlement, who wrote about it in his journal at least 10 or 12 years later. Even then, he just sort of brushes by it, endorsing Winslow by referring to not feigned but true reports. Quoting Bradford, "They now began to gather in the small harvest they had, and to fit up their houses against the winter, being all were recovered in health and strength, and had all things in good plenty. For as some were thus employed in affairs abroad, others were exercised in fishing, about cod and bass and other fish, of which they took in good store, of which each family had its portion. All summer there was no want, and now began to come in store of wildfowl as winter approached, of which this place did abound when they came first, but afterwards decreased by degrees. And besides waterfowl, there was great store of wild turkeys, of which they took many, besides venison, etc. Besides, they had about a peck of meal a week to a person, or now since harvest Indian corn to the proportion, which made many afterwards write so large of their plenty here to their friends in England, which were not feigned but true reports." Okay, that's it. That's all of it. That's what the entire first Thanksgiving story is based on. Everything else is speculation, interpretation, some questionable third and fourth hand accounts, and guesswork. Some of it informed, all too much of it not. Now, there are some things we can tell from these accounts. For one thing, based on other references in those same sources, we know the event took place after September 18th and before November 9th. Most likely it was in late September or the beginning of October, as that would have been shortly after harvest. In considering the event, the first thing to realize is that this was not a Thanksgiving. To someone of the period, a Thanksgiving was a religious occasion, a day set aside for prayer to give thanks to God for some special and unexpected blessing. So no, this was not a Thanksgiving. Such a day would occur occasionally as the cause arose. To plan for one in advance, especially to plan for one every year as we do now, would have been regarded as a gross presumption on God's will and God's intentions. What this was instead was a very traditional, very English harvest feast, a celebration of a good harvest to which it was customary to invite those who had been helpful to you over the course of the year, which is surely why the natives were there. They had indeed been helpful, so they were invited. And yes, that is the best understanding of this. The revisionists would have it that the natives simply crashed the party, but perhaps realizing that put the natives in a rather unfavorable light, that got revised to a version I first heard a couple of years ago, where natives who happened to be in the vicinity heard the gunfire from the militia drill, figured that Plymouth was under attack, ran 30 miles back to Massasoit's village, where he gathered up a force of men and got 30 miles back to Plymouth, all in the limited time frame available, an account which frankly strikes me as utterly ridiculous. Especially when you note that Winslow's account shows no hint, no trace of either distress or surprise at the natives' presence. One other thing here, it's true the settlers did not have a good harvest. Note that Bradford calls it small, but they had a harvest. That surely raised everyone's spirits. It indicated that, yeah, we're going to make it. Reason enough for a celebration, especially considering what they had been through to get to that point, including the death by disease, probably pneumonia, of half of their numbers in the first months. Though I want to make a quick aside, too, to explain a rather subtle point rather more clearly. To Europeans of the 17th century, especially the more religiously conservative sorts who were the leaders of the Plymouth settlement, they didn't make the sort of clear distinctions between what's religious and what's secular that we do today. The sense of, a feeling, an awareness of the hand of God or the will of God in everyday events was much more central to their lives than it is to the vast majority of us now. What that means here is that the 1621 harvest feast would surely have included prayers of thanks to God, perhaps a sermon from their religious leader, Elder William Brewster, they would have been significant features of the event, just as prayer would have been a frequent event of their everyday lives, everything from meals to musket drills to mucking in their fields, tending the crops. However, they would not, again, have regarded this as a day of thanksgiving as they understood the term. While prayers would have been significant features of the event, they would not have been the purpose of it. Celebration was, feasting was the purpose. Put another way, had we been able to witness the 1621 feast, to our modern eyes, there surely would have been more than enough, praying, giving thanks, singing psalms and hymns and so on, to make it look like a religious or at least religiously inspired event. But to a person of the 17th century, it would have looked, about as secular as such a thing would get. Anyway, back to our story. As for the eternal question of what they ate, we can be confident they had fowl, such as duck or goose, as the governor sent 4 men on fowling in preparation. And yes, quite possibly turkey, of which they took many, Bradford said. We can also assume they had fish, specifically cod and bass, which are mentioned in the sources, and likely deer. Now, I want to make another aside, this one on the matter of historical interpretation, specifically of using historical sources without running too far ahead of them, a sin of which too many of the revisionist accounts are repeatedly guilty, the sin of making too much out of too little. Note that Winslow says the natives went out and killed 5 deer, but he also says, which they bestowed on our governor, that being William Bradford, and upon the captain, that being Miles Standish, and others. In other words, they were given to various leaders of the community, not to the community as a whole. More to the point, we can't tell if those deer were brought to the feast and brought soon enough to be butchered, dressed, cooked, and presented as part of that feast. Or were they brought afterwards as a sort of thank you, a reciprocal gift in return for having been feasted for 3 days? And that's an interpretation personally I find more likely, in part because Winslow says the natives went out and killed 5 deer rather than they brought 5 deer. Bradford's mention of venison doesn't resolve things because in the period, venison meant hunted meat, which includes deer but isn't limited to it. In fact, in the period, the meat of, for example, hares was called venison. So while they quite probably had deer, either from the natives or from their own hunting or both, we actually can't say for certain. All right, getting back to the menu, though, another real possibility is shellfish and lobster and such. Elsewhere in the letter that I quoted, Winslow says they are plentiful in the area, as are, he says, eels, of which he claims they could take a hogshead in a night. Now, if you think eels, just consider that an English person of the period would say they're just another sort of fish. What's the big deal? A hogshead, by the way, is a kind of large cask, holds about 63 gallons of liquid, which means Winslow was probably exaggerating, and he actually could be like that. All right, beyond this, we can reasonably argue for a sort of pie made from squash from their gardens, sweetened with dried fruit, which they would have brought from England, and some salad from other stuff from their gardens, and a sort of coarse cornbread. Now again, some interpretation here only to show the importance of interpretation in judging history. Some argue that it couldn't have been pie or bread because the settlement had no oven. Well, it's true, the primary sources covering the early several years of Plymouth make no mention of ovens, but they make no mention one way or the other. Either we built some or we wish we had some. And at the same time, there are a number of references to bread in various contexts. And with bread being such a staple of the English diet, I find it hard to accept that they got as far as harvest without having made at least a few ovens in order to make use of the grains they were growing, which were primarily going to be for bread. But again, right here, my real point is not so much to argue for my interpretation as to point out how much interpretation can matter in judging history. We have to tread carefully. All right, moving on. Water would have been the major, perhaps the only beverage available. Their supply of barley would be limited. Winslow says the English grains, which means wheat, rye, and oats, as well as barley, grew indifferent good, he said. There's no mention of hops. No hops, no beer, not much barley, not much ale. And even if they did have some barley, there may well not been enough time since harvest to brew it into ale. And while they did bring beer with them on the voyage, it's highly unlikely there was any significant amount of that left nearly a year later. So they might have had a little ale or maybe even a little wine that was brought from England and saved for a special occasion like this. But again, it was likely mostly and possibly only water. And by the way here, one classic of the revisionists is the claim that the settlers were persistently drunk because they drank a gallon of beer a day, preferring it, in the words of a number of them, even to water. Well, yeah, beer was preferred to water for two good reasons. One, being made from grains, it provided some nutrition which water didn't. In fact, in the period, beer was sometimes referred to as liquid bread. The other is that it keeps longer. Water will spoil. Warm, even tepid water is a good breeding ground for bacteria. Beer, on the other hand, is boiled in the course of preparing it, and it contains alcohol, and both of those serve to kill germs. Now, the settlers, they of course knew nothing about germs, but they did know the results. Beer keeps longer. As for the gallon a day, first, some revisionists claim it was actually only half a gallon a day, but the point is, if you've gradually been introduced to drinking beer as a regular beverage ever since you were weaned, that just doesn't seem like a big deal to me. Now, it doesn't mean nobody got drunk. It just means it was not a routine occurrence. Okay, so that's pretty much it. Pretty much everything we know or can reasonably assume about the event. Not much to build the whole mythology on, is it? Even so, it drove the pap we got fed as school children, marked by images of picnic tables laden with turkey, mashed potatoes, and apple pies, surrounded by natives dressed like they just came from the Great Plains, and smiling pilgrims dressed in fashions of the 1690s. And that same sparseness of detail, and one of the reasons I go through this almost every year, is probably a good part of the reason the event provides so much latitude to those who want to replace the childhood and childish images of noble settlers and savage natives with one of noble natives and savage settlers, who every year, regular as clockwork, treat us to the historical revisionism that has again become as traditional as cranberry sauce. In place of the happy talk mythologies of peace, love, and harmony we were spoon-fed as children, we find people snarling out dark tales of drunken, murderous, bloodthirsty settlers, facing off with natives, crashing the party, who did it only in such numbers because Massasoit feared he'd be kidnapped or killed otherwise. It's a vision that, as much as the earlier one, is an attempt to overwrite history with ideology. It is, in other words, pure bunk. In point of historical fact, relations between Plymouth and the neighboring natives were reasonably good for several decades. There were stresses and strains and disruptions, yes, but for the most part, they managed to keep together, keep intact the peace agreement mutual defense pact that they had put together in the spring of 1621. Things gradually got worse, and I won't get into all the reasons why, but the two biggest ones were population pressure, that largely out of Boston, which was founded in 1630, and disputes over land that were rooted in vast cultural differences between the natives and the settlers. For one specific, the native culture did not have a concept of land ownership. Not just that they didn't own the land or that everyone owned the land or the Great Spirit owned the land, but the idea of land as something that could be owned did not exist in the culture. To own something for the natives meant you had to be able to pick it up and carry away with you. I mean, how can you own something if you have to leave it behind anytime you go anywhere? Which makes good sense, especially for semi-nomadic natives who lived in one area one part of the year and another area another part of the year. But for the settlers, for any European, land ownership, which by its nature includes the concept of exclusive use, was an everyday concept. That cultural chasm caused all kinds of conflicts. Now the peace finally, irrevocably, completely broke down. But that was in 1675, more than 50 years after the so-called first Thanksgiving, a point at which all of the original participants, very likely, all of them were dead. The point here is that at that time, in the fall of 1621, native-settler relations were good. In fact, the very next sentences of that Winslow letter I quoted are these: "We have found the Indians very faithful in their covenant of peace with us, very loving and ready to pleasure us. We often go to them and they come to us. Some of us have been 50 miles by land in the country with them." Winslow also says that all the other native leaders in the vicinity have made peace with Plymouth on the same terms as Massasoit, as a result of which, he asserts, there is now great peace amongst the Indians themselves, which was not formerly. He goes on to say, quoting again, "We for our parts walk as peaceably and safely in the wood as in the highways in England. We entertain them familiarly in our houses, and they as friendly bestowing their venison on us. They are people without any religion or knowledge of God, yet very trusty, quick of apprehension, ripe-witted, just." And to be certain you know, trusty means trustworthy, not trusting in this context, and quick of apprehension means quick to understand, quick to grasp the meaning of something. As for religion, in his later book, Good News for New England, published in 1624, Winslow says, "Therein I erred," and goes on to describe the native religion, at least as he understands it. Now, frankly, that does not sound either like bloodthirsty settlers eager to kill natives, or like natives who feared contact with those same settlers, or felt they had to display massive force in order to avoid being kidnapped or killed. If you're still not convinced, consider that in June 1621, 3 or 4 months before this feast, the town felt it necessary to send a message to Massasoit requesting that he restrain his people from coming to the settlement in such numbers. This is from Mort's relation. This is the heart of the message they sent to Massasoit. "But whereas his people come very often and very many together unto us, bringing for the most part their wives and children with them, they were welcome. Yet we being but strangers as yet at Pawtuxet, alias New Plymouth, and not knowing how our corn might prosper, we could no longer give them such entertainment as we had done and as we desired still to do." That's how afraid the natives were of the settlers. So afraid the town ultimately had to ask them to just not come around so much. Assigning the role of angel or demon to either of these peoples is trash. Neither were either. Neither were demons, neither were angels. So I reject the revisionist history. Indeed, I resent the revisionist history. I resent it first because it's lousy history. It's based on ideology, not information. It looks to satisfy the demands of politics, not of scholarship. And it is every bit as full of false tales and mythology as the nonsense and pap we got fed as schoolchildren. Plymouth in the fall of 1621 genuinely was a scene of peaceful and friendly relations of good feeling between the English settlers and their nearest native neighbors. The first Thanksgiving was a moment of celebration when everyone on both sides, even if they might still be a little wary of each other, both sides believed that, yeah, this is going to work out. We're going to be able to do this. Okay, that wasn't going to happen. It was a false hope, even a foolish hope. It was a brief enough moment, lasting even by a generous understanding no more than a few decades, and a rare enough moment in our nation's history of cruelty toward and genocide of the native peoples of this continent, such that while the first Thanksgiving shouldn't be a source of happily ever after, why can't we all get along fairy stories, neither is there any reason to co-opt it into the service of ideology-driven revisionism. Because that moment of hope did exist, and frankly, I resent the attempts to strip away that one moment of hope in pursuit of a modern political agenda. I remember a friend of mine some years ago talking about the urge to find angelic forces in the world. That is the seeming need many of us have to fix on some group, some movement, something that we can convince ourselves is utterly pure in its motives and behavior. In our attempts to find better balance in our understanding of what was done to the natives of North America, the cruelties inflicted on them, the racism and bigotry which targeted them and which still target them, too many of us, in considering the so-called pilgrims of Plymouth, have chosen simply to swap one mythology for a perhaps more satisfying but equally false one. Balance, it seems, is still a long way off. I'm going to wrap this up with a few quick sidebars about the time before any of what I've talked about happened, a few details surrounding the first months that you might find worth noting. First, you often hear the Mayflower referred to as a small ship. To our eyes it is, but at 180 ton, it was somewhat larger than an average merchant ship of the period, which went around 140 to 160 ton. A ton being a large cask that became used as a standard measure of the capacity of a ship's hold. You'll also often hear the passengers came for religious freedom. They did not. First, that would only have applied to a minority of those on the Mayflower. Not only did they not believe in religious freedom as we understand the term, freedom being equated with anarchy, to the degree that they sought what they would call liberty of conscience, those who had been to Holland, which was that minority, they had it there. In fact, that's the reason they went to Holland in the first place, because they refused to be part of the King's Church, the Church of England. They were held to be criminals. In fact, some of them had been in prison because of this. Unfortunately for them, they not only found such liberty of conscience in Holland, they also found poverty to a degree that threatened to fracture their community. In fact, they thought it was dissolving before their eyes. That's why they came here. As for the majority, they came for what I suppose you could call that most cliched of American reasons. They came for a better life. It had also been asserted that the first winter was marked by starvation. I've even heard a claim that they all would have starved to death, but for the corn, which is somehow expanded in the revisionist accounts to be corn, squash, and beans, that they saw from a cache while exploring Cape Cod. And this is partly true. The deaths first, the deaths came from pneumonia, as I said. That's the most likely cause. And starvation was not an issue. They did steal food, but it was seed corn, which means that it was calling it a quantity that would provide for the town for the entire winter just makes no sense. But make no mistake, this did involve disturbing some graves, and that was a really scummy thing to do. In fact, it wasn't the only scummy thing they did. They also stole some things from the houses that they found because they thought they were what a modern person might call interesting artifacts. Now, in fairness, I have to say that they promised themselves they would make good for what they took when they were able to contact those people, the Nauset, the following spring, which they did. But while that eases the wrong, it doesn't excuse it. All right, finally, they were not greeted by the indigenous people. In fact, they didn't speak to a native till March, and that was to Samoset, an Abenaki who was from what's now Maine. It wasn't until a couple of weeks after that that they first spoke to a native who was from the local area, that being Squanto, who in some sources is identified as Tisquantum. So that's it. That's all of it. That's everything. So I'm going to wrap this up here by saying I hope you enjoy your Turkey Day. I hope you have time to spend with your family or friends, or better yet, both, but keeping yourself safe as you do it. And I hope you understand why I celebrate the day, not so much as an expression of thankfulness for the past or the present, as hope for the future. That hope, too, may prove to be as foolish as that of 1621, and indeed these days I often think it is. But the blunt fact is, hope is the one absolute, indispensable requirement for any effort to make that future a better one. We're done. I'm out of here. See you in 2 weeks. In the meantime, peace.